installations and so on. And among other things, he curated this very well-known exhibition called Fuck/Off with Feng Boyi. Recently, he's been turning to his interest to architecture and design. For example, among many other things, he was the artistic consultant for Time for the Bird's Nest project, and since they could not understand or take his criticisms, he withdrew from the project. And he was also very critical, rightly so, I think, of the way in which the opening ceremony for the Beijing Olympics was staged. He has also built a kind of artistic compound in an area near Beijing, in Xiaochangdi, where he has a studio and where he welcomes his friends and sometimes the police. As you know, he's an outspoken and courageous spokesperson for many social issues in contemporary art and China. Now, I have no idea what he's going to talk about today. I mean, he may talk about design, he may talk about art, he may talk about China, but we have no guarantee that any of these things will happen. We do hope that he's going to talk about Weiwei. So we present Weiwei, and I leave the stage open to him. And Phil has agreed to translate for him. So, Weiwei.
我没有准备，因为我听到这个题目叫做“设计中国”，我觉得“设计中国”不知道是到底是什么意思啊？就像你说这个，算了，我不说了。
So, good morning, everyone. He didn't prepare because when he heard the topic designing China, he didn't know what it meant. He thought you could just as easily call it effing China, but he won't go there.
我觉得中国现在那只能说中国了，好像我是一个中国人的，我在美国待过12年，然后我始终还是一个持中国护照的这么一个人。来到上海这个地方呢，我从来没有过一个好的感觉，因为上海确实是非常具有代表性的中国的这么一个地方。
So our topic today is China, so I'll talk about China. I'm Chinese. I happen to spend 12 years in the United States, but from beginning to end, I've always held a Chinese passport. Every time I come to Shanghai, I discover why I hate it so much, because it represents everything that is China.
上海给我的感觉是一个家奴的感觉。什么是家奴的感觉？我想知道，大家很多人都会能感觉到。他们在这个不同的历史时期，在不同的这个强权之下，获得了极大的利益，但是仍然是脱离不了这种家奴的这种状态啊。
Shanghai is a place that feels inherently cheap. It's been at the winning end of various interests and various historical configurations throughout time, but it can't shake this fundamental feeling in the end.
去年发生在上海的一个非常小的一件事情，就很能够极清楚地说明这个问题。在去年的7月的时候，有一个来自北京的一个年轻人，曾经为了骑自行车可能第一次来到上海来进行一次旅游，但是在闸北区就被闸北的公安所严重的打了以后呢，这个北京的年轻人不服，那么他就想通过他个人的努力来经过上海的所有的这种监督机关来进行上诉，但是呢，得到的回答显然是一种搪塞和这种推诿，使他最后无法为自己获得这么一种基本的这种正义的方式，和公平的方式。那么最后造成了去年7月1号，当然后面的事实只是一个 一个推测啊，因为这个后来对他的审判是完全是是在一个不合理的一个方式中进行的，所以说呢，他最后杀了6个警察，然后呢，最后被判处了死刑。那么他的整个审判过程中，无论是1审还是2审，还是到最后的高院的终审，都体现出中国体制性的、司法性的这个对这个今天中国的关于这个法治、伦理还有道德上面的种种缺陷。这个缺陷呢，正在中国的每一处每一个地方都会表现出来，而且正在表现出来。那么上海作为一个最典型的一个城市，自己觉得自己是一个很开放的城市啊，很这个国际化的城市，但实际上，在这些问题上仍然是处在一个极为落后的状态。包括最近，几天前对这个一个上海的一次很大的一个叫做保护这个世博的一次活动中，对60多个人进行了逮捕。那么其中至少有很大一部分是错误的抓了。那么这个在很多报纸上也能看到。
So, just to give you an example of the problems of Shanghai, last July, a tragic case happened in which a tourist from Beijing, a young man by the name of Yang Jia, was taken in by the police in Jiabei district. He was riding his bicycle. He was taken in. He was beaten brutally. And returning to Beijing, he spent a year looking for justice through every possible channel allowed by the system, so all of the sort of supervisory committees and organs, and receiving no answer at all, he could not but commit what turned out to be a brutal act of violence, although it's hard now to even render judgment on that because the trial process was so fundamentally flawed at the first, second, and final level. He snuck into a police dormitory and murdered 6 policemen and was sentenced to death, and the sentence was executed in November. But this is this whole case and the whole judicial process shows the problems, basic problems with the Chinese system, which exist at the levels of law, morality, and ethics. They're problems that are present everywhere. And Shanghai, in this way, is a classic Chinese city because it believes itself to be open and international, but in fact, it's still operating on a very feudal mentality or lacking mentality. Including a recent incident where 60 people were detained in anticipation of the World Expo, many of them wrongly, and this is being reported everywhere now as well.
为什么扯到这件事呢？因为最近，也就是1个星期以前，我去过四川。那么在成都呢，我是为一个被控诉为煽动颠覆国家政权罪的一个人作证。那么我作为一个法庭的证人，我去了四川以后，在成都，在这个凌晨3点钟，我们被几10个警察从这个我们的饭店中，用最暴力的方式给这个把我们的门给踹开。然后呢，当我问他们要执法的证据和依据和这个他们警员的警证的时候呢，我个人已经就被他们给使用了暴力。所以我提到这个事儿呢，只是想谈到在中国的司法和中国的这个无论是执法者还是这个法院还是这个检察院，都是由于不能有独立的这个这么一个体系和权利，所以致使他们成为了一个腐败的一个核心的这么一个位置。这个位置我们可以很清楚地看到，它造成了在中国所判的每一起案件和每一起这个跟这个法治有关的事件，都是存在着严重的这个扭曲和腐败。
Okay, so a week ago, I went to Sichuan, to Chengdu, where a man by the name of Tan Zuoren was under trial for treason and for revealing state secrets. I went as a witness, and in my hotel at 3 a.m., cops violently opened the door. I asked to see their badges, and as I was asking, I was violently attacked. I mentioned this as a way of keeping him from going to testify at the trial. I mentioned this as a way to say that in China, whether it's the law enforcement agencies, the courts, or the investigative bodies, above all of those, because the system is not completely built out, these places have become centers of corruption, and every single case can reveal this corrupt side of China.
Well， 这是好像是很小的问题，但是这个问题实际上是关系到每一个中国人的生存的品质和我们生存的条件的问题啊。大家可能对这个事情没太大兴趣，但既然我在这儿，我还是得谈谈这种事情。因为说到设计中国，那么如果在这个一些最基本的价值观上，比如说通常我们说自由、公正、平等。这个人权这些价值观上，我们仍然没有作为中国仍然没有一个在这些方面的一个基本共识的话，那么这个社会是一个什么样的社会？我希望大家能够清楚，不要简单的看到它所谓的繁荣和这个在经济上的成功。我觉得这个我们可能之后能谈起，但是在这些基本的价值观上，我们在这个中国的60年中几乎没有进步。无论是从体制上，还是从法制上，还是从这个一些基本价值观上，我们仍然是处在一个极为野蛮和黑暗的时期。
So it seems like a little question, but this has to do with the quality of life and the basic existence of every Chinese person. Maybe nobody cares about this, but I'm here, so I'll talk about it. Because we're talking about designing China, I think we need to start from the questions of basic fairness, of human rights, of freedom. And these are concepts which China, for all its economic development and success, has still not come to a basic understanding of. So you should see that and not just China's surface level economic success. The basic values these basic values I mentioned have had no progress in the last 60 years, basically since the PRC has been established, by which I mean whether you're talking about the perspective of the system of law or of basic morality. So while China may look bright and shining, it's actually wild and dark.
今天的所谓的富强是建立在一个什么样的一个基础上呢？我们这是必然要问的一个问题。那么它是很简单的建立在一个专制体制下的一个对财富的一个垄断和掠夺。
So people ask, what's the foundation for China's wealth and strength today? And I say the answer is quite simple. It's a totalitarian foundation which uses monopolistic control of wealth and resources to achieve its means at any cost.
它的每一点荣誉和每一点可以被炫耀的地方都隐藏着巨大的耻辱和巨大的不公正和缺少基本的正义。
So everything that might appear honorable or as a reason for pride, actually beneath it holds humiliation, unfairness, and a basic lack of justice.
我大概就想简单的说这些啊，当然你们也可以。忘记这些，但是我希望下面能够接受你们的提问，然后我愿意回答你们的问题。
So I'm just speaking to you today very simply. You can certainly choose to forget everything I've just said, but I think it might be best to just open it up and take your questions.
Listen, I did that just as a gesture because I think for this seminar is going to be a very special one. I think all of us who are here today will have to leave our politeness at the door because I think we're going to talk about real issues. I think Weiwei has put some issues on the table which are fundamental and issues that I think we have not entirely ignored, but issues that we've been skirting around a bit. So let's look at some of these issues directly now. But I think another thing to say is that these issues are not really entirely simple one. I mean, it's not a kind of black and white situation that we're dealing with. Now, for example, and let me just start a kind of discussion because we would certainly like to engage Weiwei in a discussion, but I think we'll have to find a way of doing it. Right? We'll to find a way of engaging him at a level that would be productive for all of us. I can start with his remark that he hates Shanghai because it represents everything that is China. Now, a lot of people would also say that Weiwei himself is everything that is China. And by that, this is not in any way a put down, because it's like The other point he made about Shanghai is that at one level it might look bright and shiny. At another level, it's wild and dark. I think the relationship maybe between Weiwei and Shanghai would be this: that it seems to me, in what you're saying, in the moral passion with which you voice your criticism, that he might look wild and dark, but there's also something bright and shiny there. I'm sorry if you would take that as an insult. But I think that might be one way of bringing out some of the complexities of the issues that would be confronting us. Now, the other point he made, which is something I think that is really worth discussing in relationship to Shanghai, is this sense that in China today everything is, and Shanghai would be a perfect case of this. It's a place that is trying to be open, international, modern, up-to-date, and so on and so forth. Yet, at the same time, it is shot through with a feudal mentality. Now, I think there can be historical reasons why this is so, but at one level, this is certainly so. And the sense that you get in China, of course, and this is the point that I might want to raise for the question, is that things are actually here neither lawful nor lawless. I mean, to say that everything is lawless, I think would be a slight simplification. Everything is quasi-lawless, or quasi-lawful. I mean, there's always this sort of room for negotiation which opens the door, for example, for corruption, which is, of course, the major issue. And with corruption, which is certainly a big problem for a society that is changing so quickly as China is today, with so many sort of ambitions that China has. Corruption is certainly a major issue, and issues therefore of social justice would of course be crucial. But it's like one way of posing the question, of course, is to say, what can we do under these circumstances to bring about greater social justice? And of course, these issues are entirely relevant to the questions of design and designing China, particularly. Like it's related to, for example, to a notion of sustainability. The question of sustainability that you want to ask is not how to make cities sustainable, but how can cities sustain us? What kind of sustainability are we talking about? What kind of city do you want, for example? Similarly, in terms of China and design, I think a question was asked yesterday about what we want design to do, right? What is design for? Now, I don't think that question has one answer. I mean, design can be doing many different things and not one thing. But I think some of the issues that Weiwei is putting on the table are certainly worthy of our attention. Now, I don't know how he would like to sort of engage in an exchange with us, and I leave it entirely up to him how we should do it. I mean, you might want to respond, or you might not want to respond. It's entirely up to you. But we can ask other people maybe to state ideas and opinions, and hopefully sort of begin a dialogue.
Great. Great.
And we're going to open the floor.
I think he's totally fine understanding English questions. His English is actually perfect also, but he likes to speak in Chinese in front of groups, so that's why I'm here. But so just ask your question as you would, and then he'll probably reply in Chinese, and I'll translate.
Based on what you're saying about dictatorial power and the kind of facade of sunniness, what should foreigners who are doing here do? Should we be doing architecture in China? Should we be doing business and finance in China? Should we be doing academic workshops in China?
我觉得外国人在这做什么，完全是来自于他们个人的兴趣或者他们的利益。我觉得这个还是最主要的。我们看到有很多的这个西方的人，他们当然用着各种各样的方式进来过，但是呢，最终我们都是看到的是利益的一个体现。 这个我已经对这个西方的这种民主和这种和这个对他们在中国的这些做法，我已经看得觉得实在是是比较的简单，也很缺少一致性。所以呢，我觉得你们最好就是在这儿拿着照相机去到那旅游点拍点照片，然后多吃点中国饭，然后回去给你们的这个朋友们告诉他们，我们曾经去过这么一个地方。
Sorry. So I've seen foreigners come in and out of China over the years quite a lot, and in the end, what they do here has to do with interest, whether it's interest in the sense of something you're interested in, or interest in the sense of, in Chinese, 兴趣 or 利益, which are both interest, but the two sides of interest. And I maintain no illusions about Western democracy and what kinds of things it's tried to accomplish inside of China, so my advice is come here, walk around, take pictures, eat some Chinese food, and go home and tell your friends you had a really great time.
最简单的一个例子就是去年的这个奥运会。那么这个奥运会实在是一个耻辱的会，对于一个真正的中国人来说。那么很明显，它是一个由中央政府来举行的一次宣传式的一个会议。那么并不跟这个全民的体育，当然跟体育毫无关系，但是跟全民的欢庆也没有关系。很多这个北京的报纸可以就是明确的写在上面，最大的支持对奥运会就是待在家里看电视。那么大多数的民工都被赶回了他们，你知道，大多数民工在北京就有几百万人会赶回，停止了所有的工程，然后把他们赶回到他们这个原来的驻籍的地方。那么中国的北京还有各省都实行了最严厉的一个管理的一个方式。那么安全和这个当然是以安全的名义，我不知道在中国怎么不安全。这个这里面当然有这个美国人的功劳因为我们可以看到这个整个在西方这个奥运会的直播是被NBC 来垄断的。那么 NBC 当然为了自己的生意是不可能说一句不好的话的。那么在将近有100个媒体采访我的时候，就没有 NBC 的人来做过任何采访。就有一天他们打来电话说，你能不能到我们这儿来表演一下怎么写毛笔字？我说 fuck you 然后这帮傻逼啊，是吧？他们所代表的是什么呢？是可口可乐、麦当劳，然后这些体育用品公司，这真是一帮傻逼啊。
I will, don't worry. So I guess the most classic example of all of this would be the Olympics, which were a humiliation for all Chinese people. Of course, we all know that this was a propaganda party put on by the central government. Of course, we know it had no connection to sports, but it also had no connection to the Chinese people's feelings. If the Beijing newspapers could say to the Beijingers that the greatest support they could offer is to stay at home and watch it on TV, something's wrong. Millions of migrant workers were sent back to their ancestral homes. Construction projects were stopped. Beijing went under an immense lockdown in the name of security, although since when Beijing has ever been unsafe, it's unclear. Of course, there's also an American sort of enabling element to this as well. Of the 100+ media who interviewed me during the Olympic period, NBC was the only one that didn't, because they're on the side of Coca-Cola and KFC and various sporting goods companies and people who need China desperately to do business. So these cunts called him and said to come and write, to come to the studio and demonstrate how to write Chinese calligraphy. And he said, fuck off.
I just want to ask you, how do you consider the future of the corruption that you've described?
这是一个很好的问题，也是我每天都要问的一个问题我们都知道，这个国家已经很快就要60年了，在这个60年的努力当中，我们经过了各种各样的坎坷，那么很多代人都丧失了他们的机会和他们的在一生中丧失了他们的快乐。那么 直到今天，我们还有一些最基本的问题没有解决，比如说，选举的问题，比如说公民这个投票选举的问题，比如说基本的言论自由、媒体的开放。那么对于一个普通人是没有机会获得准确的信息和表达个人的观点的，那么更不要说自由的交流。如果一个政府是这样来对待他的民众的话，他说什么都没有用。这是一个基本的权利，这个权利在任何地方，在任何信仰下，在任何的不同的文化下，我们都是有同样的最基本的这个价值。离开了这个基本价值，其他都是在放屁。所以呢，我对中国的这个能够是不是有可能走向一个民主的道路，是不是有可能走向一个真正的改变，我是很怀疑的，因为这个体制如此之大。那么它并不是说这里的人可能都是好人，但是并不是说他有这个能力，现在或者是有这个愿望，甚至来试图来做这一个改变。那么我们可以看到，中国是一个非常缺少理想和缺少美学的一个现实。那么在一个最基本的这些价值观都被抹杀了以后，是简直一团混乱。
Okay, that's a very good question. It's a question I ask every day. We all know that this country is about to turn 60, and in these 60 years of diligent striving upward, many and countless people have lost their professional lives and lost their basic happiness at each political turn in the story. And yet, these basic problems still remain. There's no democracy at the level of citizens and voting. There's no basic freedom of speech, and there's no openness of media. And so it makes me wonder how in a society where people can't even get accurate information about certain things, let alone have a free exchange of ideas, how can anything else that the government says be believed? And we can all see this. If you leave these basic values, then anything else you might do is farting. So the question is whether China can be a democracy, but I doubt it because the system is so big, and you can't say that everyone in the government system is bad, but you can say that such a massive organization doesn't have the desire or the ability to make these kinds of changes. There is a basic surrendering of basic ideals, aesthetics, values that happened at the beginning of this all, and it hasn't been righted.
I'm sorry, it might be a little bit complicated, but it's two related questions, and it's about kind of the singularity of China, and because you were so brief in the presentation. One is, you pointed at Shanghai, but then talked about China as a whole, and what is China when you describe it? Is it the government? Is it some idea of nation? And so I'd like to know a little bit about the uneven geography of this China. Are there pockets of resistance or escape? And the second is the singularity of you presenting yourself as Chinese, having spent 12 years in America, and given that America is an enabling element in this China, and also, but perhaps the source of this desire you have for freedom of speech and openness. So I'm wondering about Chimerica, if you're familiar with the book and the term about this kind of relationship between China and America right now.
关于什么是中国，或者是中国，我怎么样去定性一个中国的一个问题，这个确实是一个对一个中国人来说也是一个非常困难的问题。中国在过去的几百年、上千年，甚至整个的历史当中，也是始终在挣扎的这么一个问题，就是说我们何为中国，哪一块是属于中国，或者是说我们的历史或文化是哪一块是属于中国。那么在2000年的历史中，可能有将近1000年是在外夷的这种文化的这种冲击下来形成的。那么近百年呢，我们又是在一个所谓的马克思主义这么一个非常极端的暴力的和西方化的这么一个思考下，形成了中国的这个农民革命。那么在这个农民革命的过程当中呢，又完全的撕毁了这个传统的文化所留下来的一个体系，这个体系是完全被打破了。尤其当这个白话文和这个后来的 非常极端的这种政治化的这段历史。所以说，让我作为这么一段时期的一个产物来谈这个，实在也是很难令人相信的。即使我能说出什么，关于中美关系
Okay. So the first question of what is China and how to define it, it's a difficult question even for Chinese people because it's a question that China spent a good part of the last millennium trying to answer for itself. What is China? Where is China? What of Chinese culture actually belongs to China? Because of 2,000 years of recorded history, approximately 1,000 of them were kind of under the control of dynasties that might be considered non-Chinese or foreign. In one way or another, and then you add to that this last century that China spent under the sway of this extreme Western Marxist way of thinking, which created a peasant revolution, in the process of which the entire traditional system of traditional culture was basically wiped out and destroyed. Whether that's in the sort of Baihua, like the language popularizing movement of the earlier 20th century, or in the several decades of extremely political action that happened after the founding of the People's Republic. So even for me today to sit here as a Chinese and try to answer this question, I'm sort of inherently suspect.
从中美关系从一开始就不是一个什么太好的一个兆头。从这个尼克松来了，他的媳妇儿到这个动物园里去看这个熊猫开始啊，然后我们就很快的进入了一种比较接近于两个黑帮之间的交易，所以到今天，如果说美国在这个经济上的这种衰落，又和中国在这个经济问题上的如此的这种傍到一块儿啊，我觉得中国本来是在傍大款，没想到这个大款本来也正是要栽的时候，结果傍上了。所以呢，现在也分不了手，因为分了手以后也不能再从良了，所以说只能还是绑在一起啊。所以我倒想看看他们一起栽下去。
As for the sort of Sino-American relationship, it was never a pretty thing from the first moment when Nixon came to visit and his wife went to the zoo to see the pandas. It's basically been a deal among two mobsters. And so today, as the U.S. economic decline is kind of enabling China's economic rise, the two mobsters are tied together. And China never would have thought. China thought it was helping out a big rich guy, but never thought this rich guy would actually have to call in his debts. And so they can't break up because otherwise we'd all be screwed.
So two really short questions. One, and I think that takes up something you said earlier, is I think everybody knew that the spectacle of the Beijing Olympics was only based on the possibilities of a totalitarian regime to organize masses and resources, but Westerners were very much seduced by it, and I wonder about your opinion, what that tells us about Western culture actually, right, that we were seduced by this spectacle. The second question is, what we have been hearing from you so far is a negative, critical attitude, a kind of fuck-off attitude. And I understand that this is very necessary. But you're also an artist. Could you talk about creative, productive ways of actually doing something? Sort of so building on this negative, critical, very sort of like shocking, controversial attitude. So where do you go from there?
我先回答第二个问题啊。
Okay.
我先回答第二个问题。批评性和批判性，或者是说找麻烦，或者是扮演成一个这个激进主义者，本身是创造性的，并不是像通常说的这个是不是创造性，尤其在中国这是创造性的。我们都知道，很多不多的这种人，很多的被放进了监狱。那么我们现在至少有3个人在监狱里，一个叫这个徐志勇，他是公盟的一个领袖人物。那么一个叫谭作人，是做了一个非常简单的努力，是调查这个5.12的这个公民调查的。还有一个叫刘晓波，只是非常清楚地写出了自己对这个世界的看法。所以说，任何人以轻蔑的这种态度来说这个，我觉得他是不懂事儿啊。在中国，这是一个非常缺少的资源。 不像你们在美国，你在 Berkeley 想怎么闹怎么闹，但是呢，在中国不是这样的，你可以要付出你的生命的。第二，任何关于生命的努力，我们都可以认为它是最有价值的努力。关于生命的价值，还有一个他什么问题？
那个西方人怎么西方人有多么想就是看到那个奥运跟西方人怎么去被卷入这个陷阱？
我觉得关于奥运和这个西方的这种关系的问题呢，我要谈到的是，奥运只是简单的给了我们一个机会，看到整个世界的这种无论是政治和经济，他们的和这个人的基本价值之间的一种关系。我并不认为，在西方这个价值就是一个恒定的价值，它仍然是，尤其在对待像中国或者是其他国家的时候，它这个价值是非常的可调整和混乱的，甚至非常明确地表现出来它自己的利益所在。这个我们无论是在海湾战争，还是在这个美国针对很多其他的国家的问题上，我们都看出来这种两面性和这种如果我们说的话，带有虚伪性的这种以政治作为交易和这个作为这种谈判的这种手段。这同样是对一个最基本的理想和价值的一种扭曲。
Okay, so I'll start with the first question about how to do something positive in terms of making art. I would like to stress that this idea of criticality, of criticism, of finding trouble in the Chinese context is a fundamentally positive and creative act because it's so risky, and one could actually risk their own life in the process. It's not like in Berkeley where you can do and say whatever you want, no one really cares, because here the stakes are actually kind of high. And in fact, 3 people who are kind of activists par excellence, Xu Jiyong, he of the Gongmeng legal organization, Tan Zuoren, the guy who's organized the investigations into the children's deaths after the earthquake, and then Liu Xiaobo, who's a political activist also who wrote Charter 08, which is a very controversial document about sort of China's political future. They've all been detained or imprisoned, often without notice. So anyone who says that that his political interventions are negative or are fundamentally in that kind of fuck you mode are actually wrong. Okay, just wants to add something.
那么我个人在过去的7、8年中，我们做了将近60个建筑项目。同时呢，我们参与了很多这个我个人的展览也做了很多我今年就有3、4个我个人的展览，博物馆展览，我这2个月中就有2个，一个在这个你大概介绍一下就行。所以说，无论从哪一方面，我觉得这种说法都是不合适的。
Okay, so he just wants to add that also in the last 7 or 8 years he's done countless in the last several years he's done 7 or 8 major architectural projects, and in the last year he's done 3 or 4 huge museum exhibitions, including 2, one just last month at the Mori Art Museum in Tokyo, and one next month or in October at the Haus der Kunst in Munich. So don't accuse him of doing nothing positive, because actually a lot of his time is not that you were, but that he's there is a massive productive kind of output stream that's happening too. It's just not what we're talking about today. And then the question of the Western view of the Olympics, he thinks it was just an opportunity, a place where the basic political and economic relations of the world were kind of put into a clearer light for a second. So don't for a second believe that in the West, ideas of the value of human life are absolute, because particularly in relation to other countries and cultures, they're infinitely modifiable, and they can be rendered chaotic in a second, and especially when there are interests involved. So if you're talking about the Gulf War or countless other kinds of things that have happened recently, it's very easy often to see where the hypocrisy of Western politics becomes a strategy, the hypocrisy of Western politics becoming a strategy for deal-making and negotiation, and the basic distortions of relative values of human life that come out of that.
just like to underline that the theme that I was raising now, design as risk, is something that in another way we have tried to approach. But he's doing it, I think, very directly and in a way that I think is very important. So let's go on. William?
To me, Weiwei has the most interesting experience in terms of dealing with Chinese government. Today, he first told us the terrible story of himself being personally attacked by the police, the lower level parts of the China's dictatorial machine. Then he talked about the Olympic Games last year. I was going to ask him about that, but he did not tell us about the work he did in connection with the Olympic Games. As some of us know, Weiwei was instrumental in pushing through the major design project, the bird nest project, which was the main site of the Olympic Games. Here come two questions of mine. First is, Weiwei, how do you deal with the high-ranking officials in pushing through that project? The other question is, how do you negotiate between your two jobs? One is dealing with high-ranking officials. The other is defending yourself against those low-level policemen. Will you someday tell the high-ranking officials about your experience that you had just a few days ago? Will that help?
这个孙慧柱是我在纽约22年前的一个朋友，当时他在这个 NYU 读戏剧。那么22年过去以后，我们第一次见面，所以我很高兴看到他仍然是一样的年轻和漂亮。他现在已经是中国戏剧学院的这个院长，确实很高兴见到他。关于第一个问题，这里面有一点误会。我是参与了这个鸟巢的设计，那么是它的主设计师之一。可以很简单的说，没有我是不存在这个鸟巢的。但是呢，我是同时是受这个瑞士这个建筑事务所的雇佣。那么哈尔佐格德梅隆在给我提供了这个机会，让我能够参与到他们是被邀请方，那么我只是一个参与者。那么我们同时是一个竞争者，同时参与这个鸟巢设计的有13家公司，我们只是赢了这家公司，这并不是任何人给我们的一个。那么如果说我和这个政策的制定者之间的关系呢，那么实在是很痛苦的关系。因为如果是说我们不把它说成是一个秘密的话，这个鸟巢在它的整个无论是从它开始被选中到完成之间，一直存在着非常艰辛的历程。在若干时期，它甚至差点被替换掉。那么，因为有中国的这些院士和专家们提出来说，我们如果把它做成方的，会省很多钱；如果说在没有顶，只做看台的话，又能省很多钱。那么这些人是在中国是一个系统的很大的一部分。他们为这个体制提供着所谓的这个技术和这个和伦理上的支持，但我们可以看到他们在整个无论是北京还是上海，这种所有的这种专家院士们，多数扮演的是实际上是一个祸国殃民的这么一个角色。我们从世博会的这个中国馆就不难看出。这个一个叫何敬堂的这么一个建筑师建造了一个全世界最丑的一个建筑，那么这个人叫着中国馆。那么这个人呢，刚好是在北京奥运会的时候提出我们要拒绝这个外国建筑师，因为他们的东西就是奇怪、很大，然后很浪费。然后呢，中国已经成为了外国建筑师的实验场。那么这句话的结束语就是说他来盖这个上海馆。那么上海很明显，由于他的平庸和他的这种无知和他的这种在缺少文化，所以简直完全是用一种几乎是这种内部的这种方式，通过因为他选的是中国的这种评委，中国的所有的评委在不同的这个在不同的这种评比的活动中是互相给这个 给利益的，所以说他很容易拿到这么一个项目，因为他也是在所有的中国的重大项目中是个评委。那么结果是什么呢？结果是把上海的这次世博会永远的放在一个耻辱的位置上。先说这个吧。
So he's very, very glad to see his old friend, today the director of the Shanghai Theater Academy. They knew each other in New York 20 years ago, and he's happy to see that you're still so young and beautiful. There might be something of a misunderstanding about his role in the Bird's Nest, because he was actually working on behalf of Herzog and de Meuron, who were the foreign architects who'd won the competition. And they were the ones who gave him the opportunity to participate. So they were the invitee, and he was a consultant to the invitee, as opposed to actually pushing the project through on the Chinese bureaucratic levels. But he will say that throughout, the connection between this project and the Chinese sort of policy establishment was incredibly fraught. It was actually a very fragile building throughout the whole process. There were countless junctures at which the whole project might have been killed, as these Chinese design institutes, which become very important players in these projects, said things like, oh, wouldn't it be cheaper to build it as a square? Or couldn't we just remove the retractable roof, which in fact happened. And these Chinese design institutes are supposed to provide the so-called expertise and sort of ethical support for projects that happen here, but in fact they're complicit in a whole politics of back and forth. A most classic example would be the ugliest building in the world, which is the pavilion that He Jingtang has designed for as the China pavilion for the Shanghai World Expo. He Jingtang was in fact a member of the review committee for the Bird's Nest project, and he was the one who would say things like, we shouldn't have these foreign architects working in China because the buildings they propose are big and ugly and expensive. But then he, in Shanghai, is able to push a project like this through, first because Shanghai has no culture, and and it's inherently a cheap and horrible place, but then also because of this insider calculus whereby this guy is essentially on the committee for every other major project that happens. And so there's this you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours calculus where he decides this is the one that he really wants. And so in exchange for all the interest he's given to other people over time, he gets to take on this project of building the Chinese pavilion, ensuring that the World Expo will forever remain a national humiliation.
我觉得第二个问题尤其重要，是在如何使我们的善良的这个当政者们知道这个民意，或者是我们在想什么。实际上，我做了很多的努力，在过去的3年当中，我曾经建立了一个个人的博客，在这个3年当中的博客，我发表了2700篇，贴了2700篇，平均是每天贴了将近3篇文章。那么我关于一个杨家事件。非常小的一个事件，几乎没有太多人注意的一个事件，我写了70篇文章。那么我是希望这些文章有更大的一个影响力，我希望他们在百忙之中有可能看到一眼这个世界是还有什么样其他的看法。当然，显然这些努力我觉得都没有用。在今年6·4前的一个晚上，他们同时把我3个博客就一下给关掉了。那么我其中一个博客已经有1700万的读者，每天都有2万人的这个阅读量。所以说，中国的最大的问题是这个是交流的问题，是合法的渠道的问题。那么每当中国发生了任何一次动乱的时候，政府都说，哦，是因为你们为什么不能通过合法的渠道来反映你们的问题？那么这个合法的渠道在什么地方？如果新闻是不能够公开不可能自由的，那么博客会被随时去掉的。当然不但是博客去掉，最近我上的一个。这个类似于 Twitter 这么一个博客，由于我的进入，在里面将近半个月的时间，致使这个整个网站都给已经很大的一个网站给关掉了，这个叫犯佛的这么一个网站。那么现在无论我在哪个网站出现，今天如果在中国你们在网上打上我的名字，中文名字的话，那这个名字是出不来的。那么同样出不来的是几个其他的字，自由是出不来的。人权是出不来的，民主是出不来的，那么还有安慰是出不来的。另外一个出不来的字是操是永远出不来的，
So the second question of how to make politicians understand his experience. He spent the last 3 years writing a blog. In 3 years, he posted 2,700 articles, an average of 3 a day, on a case like the Yangjia cop killing death penalty case that he talked about. He actually, tiny little case in the grand scheme of things, he wrote 70 articles. And he hopes that these can have more and more influence. Hopes that officials can see his singular viewpoints among all of the other opinion that's out there. But one night in the lead up to the 20th anniversary of June 4th, his 3 blogs were deleted from the system without really notice. One of them had 1.7 million readers, a flow of 20,000 hits a day, unique visitors a day. It's China's biggest problem is actually this lack of exchange or legal channels. When political action happens, the authorities tend to ask, why don't people use the legal channels? But he asks, what are those legal channels? If the news isn't free, if blogs can be deleted arbitrarily. He mentions also Fanfo, which is sort of a Chinese Twitter. It existed for a number of months or years, but was closed down within 2 weeks of him and a number of other kind of activists getting on board and using it to send messages to each other. And today, no matter if you open a Chinese search engine and put in the 3 characters Weiwei, nothing could come up. There are a couple of words in the same predicament. One is freedom, another is human rights, a third is democracy. Then you have Weiwei, and finally, fuck. Fuck never comes up.
Yeah, I want to start with addressing the performative style of your intervention today. During the last few days, I've been talking a lot with Lu Sola and Ning Ying about reverence and irreverence, and they assured me that the more you love something, the more you have to put it down, the more harshly you have to put it down. So I cannot help but seeing also part of what you are saying as an expression of your deepest love for China. But on a different note, I wanted to ask if you could perhaps more specifically tell us something or address the specific styles and forms of intervention that you have chosen in your different art projects, in your architectural projects, and how you see them as concrete artistic interventions in the circumstances you described, and also in relation to assertion of social justice and human rights.
首先我觉得恨跟爱没关系，恨就是恨。如果说我对什么东西爱的话，我也可以表白，我比较喜欢的是个人的自由和这个每一个人的平等的权利和这种平等的机会。那么这个是不分国家和地域的，这个是我在任何地方都会有这种最简单的一个信仰，而且我不认为这是一个过多的一个要求。
Okay, so it sounds like people want to hear about other things, even so. The first thing is that he sees no connection between hate and love. Hate is simply hate. He knows how to express love. He loves freedom. He loves equality of rights and opportunity. And those are things that are not about a specific country or place, but basic desires or ideals of any specific place.
关于我的作品如何表达我的这些愿望的话，我觉得还得看作品，因为我不喜欢解释作品，我不喜欢做一个非常重复性的这么一个工作。你如果有兴趣的话，你可以看一下我的作品。但是我可以说清楚的是，我的每一件作品都跟我的信仰有关。我的每一件作品如果不能够成为表达我的最基本的信仰的时候，我认为这是一个耻辱。
As for works, he's not one to explain his works. He doesn't want to. If you're interested, you can find them. Maybe not online, but you can look at them. But he will say basically that every single work that he makes has a basic connection to his most fundamental beliefs. And if the work can't express that belief, then it's not worth doing.
我的作品始终跟一个事情的它的 所谓的这种真正的状态有关，那么它自然牵扯到价值，还有这个价值是由何而产生的，我们如何定义一个价值和当然包括真假和这个事物的这种表象，还有它的所谓的真实的这种特征，这个是我作品始终围绕的一个问题。我的公司叫在外国人看是叫 fake， 但是中文的名字叫北京发克文化发展有限公司。那么发克的拼音就是 fake， 这个是你们的一个错觉，实际上是谈的是 fuck， 但是你们看是 fake。
So this question of his works have to do often with the real state of one or another given situation. And so, of course, this touches on ideas of value, the production of value, the definition of value. And of course, that in turn includes the notion of the real versus the fake, the materiality of the real, the realness of the real. It's a question that his work has kind of returned to time and again. As for the connection between fake and fuck, his company in Beijing is called FAKE, which to a foreign or an Anglophone eye looks like fake, but pronounced in Chinese pinyin, the romanization system, it's the two syllables 发克. So the company is called Beijing 发克文化发展有限公司, which means Beijing Fuck Culture Limited Development Incorporated. Because the 发克 is not actually a word in Chinese, it's just a phonetic thing that resembles the English word fuck.
I want to ask about the art world. You came back to China around the time that there was developing, that a very bright and shiny art world was developing. And I want to ask you about the art world because it seems to me that contemporary art in China is a bit of an alibi for freedom. That doesn't mean that there's necessarily more freedom, in other places. But can you talk about the art world in relationship to the dark nature that you were referring to earlier in relationship to China?
又回到艺术，我觉得中国当然在过去的5年当中。在这个艺术方面，我觉得说艺术方面，不如说在艺术市场方面，更加引起了这个西方的这种注意。我觉得艺术市场实际上跟股票市场没有什么太大差别，它的这个它只是更加荒诞一些。因为它完全可以由少数的人来完成它的这种变化。首先这个变化并不是一个非常令人吃惊的变化，因为把中国艺术品在过去几年中所卖的总值加起来超不过几张这个梵高的作品，或者是说任何一个西方现代的卖的这个顶尖的作品，当然中国仍然自己本身有着很长的一个艺术史，这个艺术史是非常丰富，而同时又是非常有说服力的。中国也有很强的一个收藏史，这个收藏史可能不亚于任何国家的收藏的历史，所以这个中国的这种所谓的文人化倾向本身是有它的历史渊源的。
Okay, so it sounds like people keep wanting to return to art again and again. To say that in the last 5 years art has prospered in China isn't as accurate as to say that the art market has prospered in China. That's what's attracted the Western attention. And the art market, of course, is really no different from the stock market, except that it's smaller, and so it can be more accurately controlled by an even tighter, smaller group of people. These changes that have happened, or this inflation of value, isn't really amazing when you think that it's actually only a few works by Chinese artists that have gotten anywhere near the prices for works by people like Van Gogh or other Western modern masters. Which is not to say that China doesn't have its own art history, rich and convincing in its own way, because of course it does. China also has a history of collecting at least as strong and good as any other nations. So it's like that. It's not really that remarkable, kind of what's actually just happened in the art world in China.
Okay, so you don't want to talk about art. So I'm going to take your advice, and I'm going to be a foreigner who comes to Shanghai, and I'm going to look for a Chinese restaurant that have some good food. And as I'm doing that, I keep coming up against walls and whole areas of cities that are being razed to the ground. Is what's being replaced in them cheap and ugly? And what was there was also cheap and ugly? And how you, as an artist who believes that ethics and aesthetics are connected, are dealing with the changing face of the urban fabric of this city?
这个问题，我觉得是一个看上去复杂，但是实际上很简单的问题。因为49年的革命把这个土地归有了国有化，那么就说一切权利属于苏维埃，那么所有的这个过去的这个财产都属于了这么一个共和国。那么到这个30年的改革开放，尤其在近些年的土地的重新的分配和中国不光是土地，包括所有的资源，所有的资源，我说的都进行了一次重新的组合分配。那么什么人获得了这个资源和利益？他们是在什么样的一个状态下，或者说可能性下获得的？他们怎么这个城市是怎样发展的？是在一个什么人的一个要求下来发展的？它服务于谁？这些问题，是很容易讲清楚的。但是我想，我们这个会议根本不可能把这些事情给你们讲得很清楚。但是一个城市的变化完全取决于它的所谓的拥有者的这个品质的问题。那么在中国，由于城市的这个拥有者不是这个市民，那么就像这个国家的拥有者不是这个国家的公民一样，所以我们才有了今天的这种品质。那么如果我们希望它有另外一种品质，那么这个共和国必须是属于公民的，那么城市必须是属于市民的。那离这一点要求还差得非常之远，而且基本上政府已经做出保证，这是不可能的。因为我们在官方的文件里都已经看到这个国家的性质和它的这个体制的性质是不可能发生变化的，至少在17大的这个官方文件中是这样谈的。那么我们看到的是什么呢？我们看到的仅仅是绝望，是每一次以不同的理由下的一次毁坏和一次次灾难性的这种破坏。这个破坏是没有这个尽头的，不管他们尽多大的努力，用多么美好的语言来装饰这个破坏，无论是奥运会也好，还是世博也好，都是在一次一次的这个政治性的这种指标下完成私利的掠夺和这个贪污和腐败的这种可能。
Your question seems complicated, but actually it's quite simple. In 1949, the revolution put all of the property of the nation in the hands of the Soviet. Everything belonged to the Republic. And then in these 30 years of reform, there's been a reorganization and a redistribution, not only of land, but of all other resources. So the question is, who gets these resources? Who gets this land? And under what kind of a situation and with what sorts of possibilities do they get them? How do cities develop? According to whose requirements? To serve whom? These are easy questions to answer, actually, but perhaps we don't have time to get into it in all of its complexity. But the basic principle is that the changes that happen in any city have to do entirely with the taste of the person who's holding the power. And here, just as the government doesn't belong to the people, the land and the cities don't belong to their citizens. And that explains why you have this very unique urban condition, ultimately. We've been told that this fundamental separation between the people and the power will never be ameliorated either. If you look at the documents that came out of the 17th Party Congress, which emphasized that the one-party system must continue, this all speaks to the fact that each time there's an instance of what looks like progress or change, it's actually damage, and it's to political ends and to benefit private interests with connections to those political structures and ends.
So I'm interested in knowing if you have contacts with the global media activist movement. And with global media activist movement, I mean those artists and media makers from the global south, from the global north that engaged in a dialogue with activists for social justice from the global south in the last 10 years. I mean, there are also very practical implications of this question, because we had problems in Italy with servers, with the government taking over independent servers from activists, for example, but in some cases we could rely on extraterritorial servers, for example, in South America, and this was a way for us not to lose our memories, so our activist memory. So the question is about how you distribute your information about what is going on in China, and if you can rely on foreign networks too.
在这么有13亿、14、15亿，现在还闹不清多少亿了。据说17亿中国人，这个人当中呢，大概会有不会超过100个人关心这一类的问题。那么在这100个人当中，大概有20个人是在监狱里，另外20个人在试图帮这个在监狱里的人作证。那么我是其中一个，就是刚被他们阻挡在这个证人席之外，然后同时呢，还使用了暴力的手段。我想，在这个国家最害怕的事情，无非是公开表达自己的意志和自己的愿望。同时呢，如果这个愿望是跟广大的人民的利益有关，那么它就变得更加恐惧。如果这个愿望会有别人同样愿意去做这样的事情，那这就变成了一个非法的组织，那么更给了一个可以打击的理由。所以说，你所谈的好像跟我所谈的几乎没有什么关系。
China is a country of 1.3, 1.4. Some people are now saying 1.7 billion people, and of those, there's about 100 who have any interest in the questions you've just raised. 20 of those are in prison. 20 others are trying to testify on their behalf, and he's one of those latter 20. This country is most fearful of people openly expressing their opinions, and even more fearful of people organizing to express those opinions. If that organization starts to happen, then it can immediately be labeled an illegal movement, and then there's even more of a reason to kind of fiercen the attack. And so he thinks that what he's facing and experiencing has really very little connection to the kinds of dynamics that you're talking about.
I'm going to make a comment at a slight tangent before moving to my principal comment and question. I was in New Delhi last spring of last year, and the Olympic torch came to New Delhi. And you would be surprised to know, I mean, you were describing the lockdown in Beijing, you would be surprised to know that the entire central portion of New Delhi was under a lockdown when the Olympic torch came to Delhi. Now, several conclusions can be drawn from that. One is it shows the enormous power of China when a sovereign country such as India can suspend the liberties of its own citizens in order to appease a country such as China. But what it also illustrates is that this distinction that you made, which I agree with entirely, between this idea of something being shining and glittery and the dark side, is a distinction that actually, it seems to me, is the story of what we might describe as a totalitarian form of globalization. In India, there's been a huge campaign for India shining, although in the last 10 years, 200,000 farmers alone have committed suicide. So those are the kinds of stories that need to be told about many parts of the world. The question that I have for you is now a slightly different one. It seems to me, or at least I'm inclined to think that way, that there is a distinction to be drawn between the idea of a nation state and the idea of a civilization. Long before China became a nation state, it was a civilization. It has been a civilization for several thousand years. And civilizations, it seems to me, are much more ecumenical, pluralistic. Yes, there are oppressions, certainly, in civilizations too, but it seems to me that they're more accommodating. They're more accommodating of dissent. And I say this with the full awareness of the fact, of course, that the verb to civilize has certainly been used as a mechanism of oppression for a very long period of time. So I'm not naive about that. But it seems to me that the registers and idioms which we attach to the idea of civilization are quite different. So what I'm suggesting is the following. Would it be productive, in your view, to think of this distinction between the idea of China as a civilization and the idea of China as a nation state, and to say that what has been happening in the last several decades, and is happening at an alarmingly ferocious rate today, is that the idea of the nation state has triumphed over the idea of the civilization. Because the nation state has really, if I may put it this way, it knows only one logic, and that is the logic of zero-sum politics. The logic of zero-sum politics. I think that civilizations, even when they are extraordinarily oppressive, nonetheless have a much more ecumenical worldview in that sense. So these changes that you are describing, the question is, do you think it would be productive to view this distinction between China as the idea of China as a nation and the idea of China as a nation's civilization, and to say that there is a tension between these two ideas? Or is it your view, and I'm certain that you will tell me if it is so, that this is all bullshit? Thank you.
我不知道你是问这个问题还是给一个回答。首先我觉得今天我们如果谈今天的政治状态，或者作为一个国家今天的表现，毫无疑问是这个民族的文化的一个延续，或者是说这个民族的文化在今天的一个最好的表达。所以说，我觉得如果是说我对这个国家有什么看法的话，实际上我同样是对这个文化是有看法的。当然，我们今天不是一个可以完整的去讨论这个文化的问题，所以我们拿一个比较简单的国家来说这个事儿。所以说，我们不能讨论一个姑娘的品质怎么样，我们只能说她穿的怎么样，或者她今天的化妆怎么样，或者口红的颜色对不对？当然，我觉得这一切都是联系在一起的。正如列宁说，每一件事情都是和每一件事情相关的。
I don't know if you, or he doesn't know if you were giving a question, or asking a question or giving an answer, but if we talk about politics, of course, we have to say it's the continuation or the expression of the nation that underlies the politics of a given state. And so today, we can't really go into every aspect and every history of Chinese culture, but it becomes easier to use the nation as sort of a shorthand, or the nation state as a shorthand, to talk about these problems which he sees as persistent throughout the entire civilizational history. And he offered this metaphor of, it's like when you see a girl, you can't tell in one glance if she's a good girl or not. You can only remark that she's wearing nice clothes today, or she's got the right shade of lipstick on.
I'm going to refer to one of your works just to give a context for the question. And the project was the videotaping of the 5 ring roads around Beijing, which I believe, I don't know exactly, 100, 200 hours of videotape. So I understand the work as both a documentation project and a conceptual project. But my question is, how do you see the role of the automobile as a shaping force in the transformation of China that's going on? And more specifically, can you explain why the Buick is so popular in Japan, in China?
我是大概不是唯一的，也是极少的，从美国待了12年，回到中国，直到今天仍然不开车的一个人。关于汽车的问题，我想，如果从大的来谈，汽车是个人拥有汽车，当然是个人走向这种独立的一个象征，无论是在美国还是在中国都是一样。那么这个对财产的拥有和对自己的行为的一种欲望，或者是说一种满足这种欲望所需要的这种努力，都构成了人的这个生活的一个最主要的一个部分。那么在今天的北京，好像已经有了300万辆汽车。那么每天呢，北京的汽车的销售量是1200辆。那么这些如果是头尾衔接的话，1200辆是一个8公里的一条线。那么每天将有8公里的汽车放在路面上。到2010年的时候，在北京的2环之中就只够满足作为一个大的停车场。那么这些都说明了一个社会为什么具有这么大的一个市场，因为我们是一个起点是非常低的一个社会。当然在近年中又有300万人考了驾驶执照，他们都在未来几年中会买汽车。Buick 作为一个美国汽车，我坐过它，因为我朋友经常开这个车拉着我跑，它比较像一个沙发坐在里面啊，所以说中国人呢基本上是属于这个脊梁都比较软的人，掉到沙发里是会比较舒服，比那个德国车要舒服很多。然后它也比较重这个也符合这种像一个小的这种移动的这种家的感觉。再加上美国的这种给人的幻觉虽然它已经很衰败，但是人们还认为它是一个可靠的这么一个移动的一个工具吧。
So he's one of the very few people who spent 12 years in the U.S. and returned to China and still to this day doesn't drive a car. But basically, from the bigger perspective of expression or independence, whether it's the U.S. or China, buying a car is about controlling a piece of property. It's about expressing one's desires or behaviors. It's a way of turning one's diligence into sort of a tangible result and having that to show. Of course, it has other sorts of effects. 3 million, there are approximately 3 million cars on the road in Beijing right now. 1,200 new cars are sold each day. That's 8 kilometers of cars if you line them up head to tail. By the end of 2010, it's said that with the number of cars on the road, the inside of the second ring will only be enough space. If you turned it into a giant parking lot, it would only be enough space to accommodate all of the cars in Beijing. And 3 million people have gotten their driver's licenses just since the beginning of this year, and we have to anticipate that all of those people will go on to buy cars in the next few years as well. So there you have it. But as for Buicks, he has lots of friends who drive them. He thinks they're comfortable. They feel like the seats feel like sofas. They're more comfortable than German cars, and they're also heavy. And maybe more importantly, they offer this illusion of the U.S., which even if you say the U.S. has begun its long, slow decline, there's Chinese people still feel like it's a country you can depend upon and a car that can become your little home away from home and that you can drive around comfortably.
As one of the co-organizers of this event, I want to thank you, especially in the wake of the last week, for having made the effort to join us this week. Thank you very much. First, a little corrective and then a question. The corrective had to do with your passing remark about Berkeley. Berkeley is one of the most heavily policed cities in America. You can't turn a corner in the city of Berkeley without having a policeman on your trail. You can't give a public speech on the campus of the University of California at Berkeley without it being recorded. And if something untoward is said, you'll hear all about it. You can't be critical of a food company like Monsanto without fearing the loss of tenure. And that's not highly unusual across all 10 campuses of the University of California. So that just raises a question about relative degrees of freedom and unfreedom and how they massaged in different societies. In the US, one has the capacity to, of course, speak openly in various kinds of ways. Everything one writes, texts, emails, blogs, is recorded and open for surveillance in a variety of different ways, though differently than in China. I don't want to belittle the kinds of conditions under which freedom of expression is made in this country. I also want to applaud you for your unstinting commitment to principle, and for that I think we owe you deep respect and support. That said, I do want to pose what I think is a quite difficult question, at least to pose, if not for you to answer. And that is the following. In a way, it follows up on William Sun's distinction between the little bureaucrats and the large bureaucrats. Is it the case that perversely you are useful to China, and at the point at which you cease to be useful to China, the risk of your being completely closed down will inordinately appreciate, that is, will inordinately get larger and larger. You can be arrested largely out of the limelight in the provinces, and yet you can come and address pretty openly a forum like this in the big city. You know, all your texting and blogging gets surveyed, and yet you're able, in some cases, to speak pretty openly. Is it the case that the state is able to use you, right, in ways to, quote unquote, represent a certain form of China, and at the point at which you cease to represent that usefulness, watch out?
这是一个很困难的问题，因为它是建立在一种猜测上的。因为很多人说，当我在博客上，当时还我记得在去年的时候，我开始在博客上的语言比较的激烈的时候，很多人说哦，不要，就是说他不要相信他，因为他是美国公民。那我也没有办法，我觉得我还是得证实一下，所以我就把我的这个中国的护照，贴在了博客上。那么很多人说，哦，那他一定是有他的家庭的背景，或者是很多人保护。那么实际上，我的博客3个博客被同一天关掉，这个在可能博客的历史上也是没有的。那么我一次一次也是相信，总会有人有这个愿望，希望这个世界变得合理一些。当然，我今天不太这样相信了，因为，我不相信的理由是说，在这样的一个社会，在缺少一个基本的伦理和道德的一个社会，是没有人愿意承担责任的。你刚才提到了这个 Berkeley 的这个警察的情况，我也有所了解，我在 Berkeley 待过1年。那么，当然，可能这个 Auckland 更厉害一点，但是，不管怎么样，警察国家，在任何的国家都是一个非常严重的问题，因为当这个我们的意识形态的这种问题在削弱，那么个人和利益集团的矛盾就会增加，那么个人和国家的这个问题也是会凸显出来。 在中国明显的就是这样，因为在奥运前就已经宣布，成功的奥运就是安全的奥运。那么安全的奥运就是大量的警察和大量的这个监视器。最近我们只能从已经发生的事件上来看，最近对谭作人的审判的主要证据是来自他的电脑。那么国家启用电脑信件作为证据对个人来进行法律的这种审判，我觉得这是一个非常重大的一个问题，是事关每一个人的问题。在四川，我的一个志愿者被非法的关押了46个小时之后，对他进行了行政的一个处罚，罚了他500块钱。但是理由是在他发出的一个短信中，说了什么。那么国家能通过手机的一个短信来对他人进行制裁，这也是我第一次听说。但你可以看得出来，这个如果一个政权或者一个权力，它不能够在伦理上约束自己的时候，那么这个社会会变得怎样的糟糕？我们不能相信任何一个政权是完美的或者合理的，但是我们可以相信有的政权或者有的社会是可以作为一个伦理的榜样，或者至少号召这个社会努力去做的。但是在这里的情况完全不是这样。
Okay, so this is an incredibly difficult question to answer because the answer has to be grounded in speculation. About a year ago, when he started to write more politically controversial things on the blog, people started to say, don't listen to this guy, he's an American citizen. So he posted his Chinese passport on the blog, and then people started to say, well, he must have a very strong family background or some people protecting him. Nonetheless, on the day they decided to close his blog, it essentially ceased to exist as a historical record. It just disappeared entirely. He thinks there will always be people who want this world to become a more rational place, but still believes that in a society that isn't grounded on ethics or on reason, there's no sense of responsibility. So that essentially will prevent this kind of other way of governing from emerging. As for Berkeley, he spent a year there in the early 80s and believes that maybe Oakland is even worse in terms of this kind of police control. But police and police states in any country are huge problems, especially at this moment where as ideology seems to be weakening, conflicts of interest start to emerge, conflicts on that kind of more instrumental level. And here that includes conflicts between big conglomerates of interest and the government or the party itself. And so you get formulations like a successful Olympics is a safe Olympics, which is essentially based entirely on police power and surveillance technologies. As for this gentleman, Tan Zuoren, the earthquake investigator in Sichuan, the major evidence used against him in his trial are files that were taken from his personal computer. When a government can actually use things on one's own computer to prosecute you, that becomes immensely problematic. He had a volunteer who was working on this investigation project as well, who was detained for 46 hours, then released with a fine of 500 renminbi. But the actual pretext, or legal pretext for the fine, officially was the content of a text message that the volunteer had sent, and you can all see why that is deeply disturbing. Basically, it comes back to the idea that if a sovereign power can't control itself based on an intrinsic set of ideals or principles or ethics, then the results are guaranteed to be quite bad. But that possibility of a coherent guiding, governing, self-restraining ethic doesn't seem to be existent in this system as it's currently configured.